Communication leads to expectation. So if you're communicating where you're at, what you need, or what you think you need, then you create expectations from that in the relationship. That's a very mature relationship. So that's excellent, like what you're saying there. If that isn't communicated, there is no expectation. Therefore, the other person is going to keep trampling all over your personal space, and you're not going to like it, and eventually that relationship will dissolve or explode.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are so blessed to bring this to you every week. We are even more blessed that you have decided to tune in to listen to us. We are your hosts. I'm John Heinen. We've got Devin Schott and we've got Sam Guzman here with you. We come at this every single week to talk about themes and issues that are important to men, especially men who are Catholics striving for holiness. That's our goal, and we appreciate you joining us on that. Please keep us in your prayers this Lent. You are in our prayers. So today we get to talk about toxic relationships, right? To use an overused word in the secular world. Relationships are difficult, but they're an important part to being a man, and they're an important part to being a man of holiness. If you like what we talk about today, you can head over to Catholic Gentleman Plus, where we go into a longer, more extended version of this episode every single week. In addition, we also come out with monthly sessions. This month we have spiritual warfare. Next month we're coming out with our 10th session on Saint Joseph. So there's a lot of things, a lot of themes, a lot of intimate conversations that are being had for the hearts and minds of men to help us all grow in holiness in this world that is so against that pursuit. And so head over there. Great way to support us, Catholic Gentleman Plus. So Devin, Sam, how are you guys doing today?
Good. Yeah. Lent is upon us.
Doing great. Wearing a t-shirt for the first time in a very long time. Or short sleeve shirt, I should say. So I'm very happy about that.
You Southerners.
Here in February, that's right. It does feel pretty good outside in Texas here. So I had a cold this weekend, so I apologize to our listeners if my voice is a little off, but I'm on the mends and doing better. So
Good.
Great. Well, here's the first thing that I want to talk about is friendships aren't so important. We talk about it here at the Catholic Gentleman. It's one of the ruptures that happened at the fall of man. We broke our relationships with other people, and understanding other people and people understanding us is a constant point of division. You know, fast forward to today, 2024, you got this distorted understanding of what friendships are, right? Are you a great friend because you have 5,000 followers on Facebook? They're 5,000 friends, right? They get to tell you all their business, even if it's stuff that you shouldn't have any access to. And unfortunately, vice versa, right? And then in addition, I think that there's this issue of codependency that is just pervasive throughout our societies. And by that, I mean, is this misunderstanding of what relationships are or friendships are. And by that, I mean, if they're your friend and they're emotionally sad, you need to be sad. And if they're emotionally happy, you need to be happy. That your emotions are dependent on another person. And in a way, you are accountable for their emotions. And I think that's a lot of people and how they define friendship today. And so I want to discuss that. But today, we're talking about something different. We're talking about toxic and difficult relationships that need pauses and need us to put up barriers, and that we're going to go into, because we've already talked about what it means to be a true friend and how to cultivate that within yourself on our episode on how to know your true friends that we did a little while ago. And what I hope to talk about today in a very honest way is how these relationships, not just our neighbors and friends, but even our family members, affect our lives, and kind of what our responsibility and obligations are to those individuals in our lives. Because I can tell you that I get very clouded a lot of times, especially when it comes to the intimacy of family friends who are other family members in my extended family, and kind of what my role is and what my obligations are, even if our pursuits in life and our beliefs in life are completely different. And that sort of voice always sneaks into my head of, well, I need to I need to be friends with them because nobody else is giving a true witness of Christ in their life. And then I put that burden oftentimes upon myself, and I end up failing at delivering. And so I want to kind of be honest and talk about that. So Devin, I kind of wanted to shift to you when you hear this and talk a little bit about what you feel is important concerns for us to consider and address today before we actually dive into some of these methods that we've discussed and prepared.
Sure. So we're talking about detaching from problematic people. And I think there's two typical kind of responses, at least if you're a Christian, well, maybe even if you're not a Christian. I think on one hand, the Christian guilt can take a hold of us, and we feel like regardless of how bad and, as you say, toxic the relationship is, I have to be in this relationship at all costs with no boundaries, no barriers, and just let this person do whatever they are going to do to me. Okay, that's one major extreme. Then the other extreme is if you have the slightest amount of any characteristic that I dislike, or if I think you're not up to my standards or not as in the Christian world as holy as I am, I'm going to separate from you. So those are kind of the two extremes. So as we navigate this, what is the proper position? How do we handle problematic relationships? And I acknowledge right off the bat, this is very sacred ground. We've all been betrayed. We've all been wounded. We've all been maligned, perhaps even abused, right? And we all know someone who we don't like and someone who doesn't like us. Maybe a lot of people don't like us. So I think this conversation is a lot about a mission of discovery where we're trying to seek out the right way to respond. And this is another important point. We're not reacting because reactions are actually impulsive and they're knee-jerk. We're talking about responding, a way that we can analyze certain relationships, certain behaviors, and then respond properly so that we can actually live the totality of our life in a way of freedom and liberation and actually becoming the best person we can while calling other people along with us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I like how you brought up us being basically the poor friend or the difficult friend for somebody else, right? It's good for us to be honest about that because I've likely been that to many people and didn't spend a lot of time in thinking about that in preparation for this episode. So,
well, here's our really chance, John. You're on the couch.
Indeed. Think about when I failed in friendships. Not hard to do, though, for sure. Hey, Sam, so what are your thoughts when it comes to kind of setting the stage, if you will, on not necessarily the importance of relationships, but how to handle these difficult relationships that inevitably come our way?
Yeah, it's often a question of balance. I think health, wholeness is often about harmony and balance. And just like Devin was talking about in our culture today, there's two extremes. One is like people just get really entangled and enmeshed in relationships to the point where they can't even discern who they are anymore because who they are is so defined by other people and their approval or disapproval or their mood states or whatever, like that codependency that you're talking about. That's one extreme. Or it's I only exist in relationship to you. The other extreme, of course, is people who discover this idea of oh yeah, there can be unhealthy people, there can be toxic people, and so I'm going to swim to the other extreme and just cut myself off, walls up, shields up from anybody and everybody who in any way rubs me the wrong way, which is exactly what Devin's talking about, right? So there's two poles, two extremes.
Yeah.
The good news about that is it points us towards that direction of balance and harmony, which is kind of that midway between those two extremes. But what we're not, I want to emphasize very strongly, what we're not talking about when we talk about toxic people is we're not talking about cutting off anybody and everybody who rubs you the wrong way. And I want to emphasize this because, again, some people just get a little taste, a little hint of mental health awareness or, from a Christian perspective, spiritual healthiness, and they go crazy. You no longer serve my needs. See you later. You no longer, build me up. You're gone. and they just cut off family, they cut off friends, and it's just like this brutal bloodbath of cutting off everybody in your life who you don't like. And then one day you find out that you're very alone and you can't figure out why you can't get along with anyone. So between those two extremes, that's the one I want to emphasize more, because that's the tendency people have when they discover the idea of boundaries, or they discover the idea of, not letting people walk all over you, is they immediately swing to that extreme of like, my needs only, serving my ego, or you're gone. Or you're a toxic person. Everyone's a narcissist. Everyone's, self-absorbed. Everyone is toxic. And like that's not what we're talking about here. So we do want to tread carefully as usual and approach this in a nuanced way. But I just want to let everyone know ahead of time, that's not where we're going. If you're worried about that, that's not where we're going. So.
Such a great point, Sam. I really appreciate you mentioning that, because I think we can all see that in our own lives, right? And we've been very honest about it on our episode as our faith life has grown, right? So has our pursuit of virtue. And in pursuing virtue, you just all of a sudden seeing the failings of every single other person. It's if they're highlighted, and then you start even imagining failings, and you don't know how to handle those relationships. You don't know how to handle those situations. So yeah, you just write them all off, or you just assume that, God doesn't want you to have to deal with these, and we can see that, as we've discussed, both in the liturgy, among individuals that are sided one way or the other. We see that in the church, but I think we can also see that when you're like honestly trying to be an individual that doesn't speak negatively of other people. And then all of a sudden it's like every single person in your life speaks negatively. And so since you're not strong enough of an individual to overcome that temptation, or you just categorize them all as people who are bringing you to sin and occasions for sin and stuff. And so isn't that easier, right? Isn't that the way that we all desire that black and white in life, is that if it was always like this, then goodness, wouldn't things be much easier? So yeah, pendulum can swing pretty hard both directions, but we're always looking to find that means. We're always looking to find that virtue and that settled point.
Yeah, a relationship ceases to be perfect once you join it. So.
That's right. Such a good reminder. Going back to that beginning there, Devin.
Yeah, I just think that there's a problem with the challenge is that we're all looking for perfection in ourselves and in others. And it becomes kind of like this false God principle, where we're looking for the perfection of God in other people. And then when we don't find it in them, we're almost scandalized, and then we drop them. Right. And then, we really need to reflect back on ourselves. What if people were to do that to us? Because we're definitely flawed, big time. I'm majorly flawed. And if people were to do that to me, I would be, I'd be crushed, because I just feel like I couldn't trust humanity at any level. So we have to just keep in mind that that's not how Christ operated, and that's not how we should operate. And so the question is how should we operate? And I think we've got a little bit of a framework here, and you can talk about that maybe.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Before we jump in there was something that you said to me in an earlier conversation that was really honestly very helpful. And it was kind of like how to categorize people, because I was stuck up on this kind of categorizing of individuals by friends, family, neighbors. And it was unfortunately more difficult for me to simplify it in that method, right? Because there was families which have a deeper blood tie, and then there's friends from childhood versus new friends. Then there's actual neighbors, and in Scripture it says, love thy neighbor as thyself. So are we, looking at the person right next door to us, and then what happens if we move? A new neighbor, etc. Right? I could go on and on, but you had good categories. I'd love for you to bring those categories up, just so we can that are a little bit more broad. But at the same time, I think easier for the minds of men to address this conversation on friendship.
Yes. So this is from Ratzinger's book on Christian brotherhood, basically, is where I get the framework for this. And it's an incredible little beautiful work. But the idea is that in the early church, there was this idea of there's a duality really in the New Testament. There is those who are in and those who are out. You have the Ishmaels and you have the Isaacs. You have the Esau's, you have the Jacobs. You have, the chosen and the rejected. Okay. And, for better, for worse, whether you like it or not, that's the duality. That's the truth. And as we moved in from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there is this duality. It still exists. It's called the brotherhood. And so the church, inside the church, you have the brotherhood, your brothers. Then you have your neighbors. There are those who could be considered other brothers in a way, or they could just be considered non-believers, right? And then you have your enemies. So these are kind of the three camps that we fall in. And then we need to be able to assess, okay, so am I dealing with a brother? Now, how do I escalate to figure out where I'm at with this brother in relationship? Is this too toxic? Same thing with a neighbor, or a other brother, if you will, and then an enemy. And so we'll get into it in a minute, but these kind of really, for me, Ratzinger's distinction here really helped me in discerning who am I dealing with really here? How should I respond to this person? What is my behavior supposed to be like really? What can I expect from them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really appreciate that. So to jump onto the next section here, what I would like to talk about is kind of ways to deal with problematic people first. So before we start discerning different reasons why or how to identify people who are problematic or toxic in our lives, I'd love to start by talking about ways that we can deal with them, ways that a good Christian Catholic man can handle and deal with these individuals. And we've got a couple tiers here that I think are going to be really helpful for us to identify and walk through, because there are, and honestly, when you go through these tiers or we start talking about these tiers, start thinking about those issues in your life where not only were there people that needed to have these different let's call them tiers of separation, but at the same time, where maybe you failed to communicate effectively, that caused that relationship to get more negative. Because I can think of that one, and I'm going to talk about the first one here, and that is breaks.
Yeah. So why don't you list them out? The three B's.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So the three B's are breaks, and then the next level is boundaries. And then beyond that level of boundaries is actually barriers, and they increase in their magnitude and what is required of us men within our relationships with others. And so going back to that first one of breaks, that is, every relationship needs pauses. Every relationship needs some separation to maintain our identity and to truly love the other person. And when I thought about this break, I immediately started thinking about the need to communicate that effectively and charitably with an individual. I think we're going to get that theme when we go through all of these. But one of them with breaks, I thought about, and I brought him up before. He was a close friend of mine. May he rest in peace now. But he used to talk to me a couple times a week. He was quite a bit older than me, a separated man, and he had a lot of time on his hands, was a good man. But I started having children, and as I started having children, my ability to stay focused on that friendship declined simply because of my obligations and responsibilities as a father greatly increased with the frequency of children that I was blessed to receive. And that started hurting his feelings. And so I just ignored that reality. I did. I ignored the fact that I knew it was hurting his feelings, and I just kind of ignored it, and just kind of was like, he's going to have to suck up and figure this out, and I realized my own failings in that, because when we had this confrontation after quite literally probably 2 to 3 years of this sort of tension, of this elephant in the room, we had this conversation, and I was just very honest with him in that moment. And we talked about, hey, just once a month is when we're going to connect. And when we connect, I'm looking forward to seeing you. And that relationship maintained, and it maintained a strong. And anytime we connected, he shared with me all his happenings in life and the books that he was working on and the classes he was teaching and things like that. And it was really good. And I realized that I had gone through this difficult, tense situation for quite literally a couple years because I just didn't open my mouth, and I was just hoping he would just figure it out. And again, not a great way to do it. So, Sam, why don't you talk a little bit about breaks and the importance of these little pauses within relationships to help them grow stronger?
Yeah, it is important because when we talked about those two poles, right, of like complete isolation versus like codependency, where you're just so enmeshed with somebody emotionally, you can't find that proper distance. But I think it does start with communication. You owe it to the other person to be able to express yourself and express that you're feeling a little bit smothered. You're feeling like things are getting maybe too intense, and there's different ways we could talk about doing that, but the point is communication is key. So in other words, don't be John. No, I'm just kidding. But like,
That's right. I like this running theme. It's good.
Yeah, it's fun throwing you under the bus, John. But yeah,
it's good.
But no, like every relationship does need breathing room. Like inhale, exhale, right? Like there's movements of moving toward and sometimes stepping back. And that is necessary for health. Even I would go so far as to say in marriage, if you are only spending time with your wife and you never get away to spend time with other guys and she never gets away to spend time with other women, you're going to start feeling smothered. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean you don't love her. It doesn't mean you don't enjoy spending time with her. But it's necessary for creating a healthy distance. Relationships thrive on that perfect amount of distance where it's like you're not so close that you're clinging and smothering, but you're not so far away that there's no connection there. There's no emotional depth. And so it is a little bit of a dance, right? You're like, well, how do I find that? Well, you don't know until you try. So if you are feeling like I really just need to go out with the guys, it's been a little while, it's been, a month or two, I haven't had time, right? But I need to do that. Like you need to communicate to your wife, and hopefully if she's a supportive spouse, she'll encourage you in that. But any relationship that is healthy will allow room for that. And it's actually very revealing if the other person gets angry about that, upset about that, and starts to resent you for that. Like that's kind of a red flag, right? Whether it's a friendship or a marriage or something like that. If they can't handle a little bit of separation, things are headed in an unhealthy direction. So the thing I would encourage you to do is if you really need to trust your intuition a little bit. If you're being around somebody makes you really uncomfortable, makes you really squirm, makes you really feel smothered or like, drained of energy or things like that, those are usually warning signs that you might need a break. Mm-hmm. You might need some separation. You might need a little bit of distance. And that's okay. That's a part of healthy attachment. So take a step in that direction. Maybe communicate something like that. Express what would be helpful to you. Like, I just need to go out with my guy friends or whatever it is. Or like John, like, hey, we're talking too much on the phone. I have a family. I have a wife now. My circumstances have changed. I still care about you as a friend, but I just need to decrease the frequency of how much we're talking because it's not something that's sustainable for me, but I still want to talk to you. I still want to communicate with you. Like, how can we make this work? And again, if they freak out, if they get angry at you or they lash out or act all hurt or pout or have a pity party, like that's a sign that the relationship has already gotten unhealthy. So just a few thoughts there, but yes, separation and return, like there's like a healthy flow and dance in a relationship and it's a necessary part. And if you don't have that, things are going to get, unhealthy for both of you. It's not just about you, it's about the other person too. So
yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. Devin, what are your thoughts?
That's great. Communication leads to expectation. So if you're communicating where you're at, what you need or what you think you need, then you create expectations from that in the relationship. That's a very mature relationship. So that's excellent. Like what you're saying there. If that isn't communicated, there is no expectation. Therefore, the other person is going to keep trampling all over your personal space, and you're not going to like it. And eventually that relationship will dissolve or explode. And so this is a great framework, because what you're doing, like Sam, what you were just talking about, you said it twice where, okay, the break isn't, I suggest this break. Here's why. This is what we need to do. And if the person expresses any kind of anger or resentment, you know that you've got to go to the second B, which is, so you go from breaks to boundaries. And then if it continues to escalate, you're like, okay, I'm examining this relationship. Is this where I need to implement a barrier? And so I love that. I love what you're saying there is like, look, I'm evaluating this relationship and we really need a break here. That's great. If the person's mature, excellent. If they're not mature and the relationship isn't mature, I need to assess this. And is this where I need to develop some boundaries and really, examine what kind of boundaries I need to put in place. So I think that's excellent. So communication leads to expectation, which is great because both parties know what's at stake. I remember when I was dating my wife, man, it was full on. It was like, if you think about like the sun and the moon, it was like it was daytime all the time. The sun was shining all the time. We had to be with each other every single minute of the day. Yeah. And it's like, and as much as we loved each other, we're infatuated, it was exhausting, right? And it exhausts us. And you're talking about the same things over and over. Yeah, I think I heard her say that like 30 times now. It's like, okay, where are we? And then you don't have any other relationships that are feeding you. So then you're relating that kind of information to, her. And so it becomes implosive. And that's another thing here is you can put all your pressure on one person and make them the God of your life, the son of your life. And there's no nighttime, there's no downtime. It's a huge mistake. So anyway, I know I've talked a lot, but I love that, Sam. I love how we're looking at this relationship and we're like, yeah, I need some pauses here. I'll see this person once a week for coffee or once every 3 weeks for coffee, or I'll meet with them via Zoom once a month, whatever it is. I'll give them an hour of my time. But something's not healthy here. Maybe I need to examine this through the boundary realm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just say that, man, this is requires of you a certain degree of grit to have these tense conversations with people, because I know that for me, I just didn't want to have that conversation because who likes going down this road of confrontation? But if we're able to kind of put on this mind that we're talking about here, that this is the charitable thing to do, this is the loving thing to do, as communications builds expectations, that's what we've got here is like just false expectations, mismanaged relationships that don't help anybody, that aren't bringing anybody closer to Christ. And so it's for the dignity of the person as well as for the liberating ourselves, of kind of this tie that we've put upon this relationship simply because we're not willing to have that tough conversation. So when we move to that next level of boundaries, this is the one that I do think that conversation needs to be very effectively communicated. And this level of boundaries is basically to the next degree of, hey, I'll meet with you, but we're going to limit it to X amount of time. Or when we get together, I can't talk. I can't have gossip. I can't have negative talk, right? This type of person is somebody that you'll likely never have a great relationship with in your life for various reasons, right? And that's okay. We can't be best friends with every single person that we meet, regardless of what your, 10-year-old child will tell you. And so we've got to understand these relationships where they're at. And if somebody that you just can't have a great relationship with, maybe they're just not on the same maturity level as you. And in which case they're not a bad person, and they might be in close proximity. They might be a neighbor, that's right next to you. But when those situations arise, I think it's incredibly important to put very clear boundaries on the things that are just kind of non-negotiables within those meetings. Devin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was talking with my daughter about this. She's married now. She has 3 children, pregnant with her 4th. And we were talking about this idea of boundaries. And she said, you must be able to say no without guilt. You must be able to say no without guilt. I love that because the problem with us as we begin to advance in our relationship with Jesus Christ as Christians is there's this weird tendency at first perhaps to become kind of a doormat, and we just kind of and we think we're being Christian, but actually there are times where we have to say, no, this isn't working, or this is too much time, or I can give you an hour on this day of the week and it has to be scheduled. But if you come into you stop by my house or I'm not going to answer the phone. You know what I mean? Because this is how I need my life to operate, whatever. I know it sounds a little bit selfish, but however, if that's what you need and you've got a lot of obligations, you've got a rich family life and, that's what you need. The other person loves you. They'll abide by that. And I think this is very important. Men, especially single men, are deathly afraid of asking a woman out. They're deathly afraid of rejection. This is a great space as men where we can work with each other and challenge each other in a kind of a safety zone, especially single men, to be able to get up enough grit, as you say, enough courage to be able to ask her out. So what am I talking about here is like when you see a relationship needs some boundaries and you talk about that as men, that's kind of like flexing that muscle so that you're like, wow, I do have confidence. I do have courage. And we got through that. And you know what? Maybe I can do that in a sense of asking a woman out, dealing with kind of maybe some difficulties or uncomfortableness in the relationship and learn to work through that, not just walk away and give up or not even try. So I look at Jesus. Jesus is really a great example of, breaks and boundaries and then eventually barriers. But the breaks, he left his apostles a lot and went off to be with the Father alone. He needed that time by himself. You can't give what you don't have. So he had to get refueled by his relationship with the Father. But then, these boundaries, Peter is like, hey, you're not going to suffer like that, Lord. No way. We're not going to let that happen. And he's like, get thee behind me, Satan. This is my boundary. You're not going to speak that trash to me. That's not the gospel that I'm adhering to and that I'm going to live by. And so this is the boundary. You got to speak positively in the sense of hope that the cross is the destiny, but after that's a resurrection, not we're going to take the easiest route out of this. So Jesus is great at placing certain boundaries in relationships. And then he calls those people along. I love what he does with Peter on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after resurrection. He's like, Peter's like, hey, what about him? Talking about John. He's like, hey, what about him? What if I let him live till the end of time? That's the boundary. We're not talking about John here. We're talking about you. Yeah. So I love that. I had a friend, I still have, he's a great friend. So this is where I'd push back a little bit is that I think that sometimes when you establish boundaries in a relationship, it gives the other person the opportunity to rise up if they really want to have a great relationship with you. And then it builds into something great. Like a friend of mine, he'd get kind of envious or jealous, like when we'd hang out in crowds and stuff like that. And he wanted to be kind of like the soul friend, and so it'd be like this kind of stage of maybe a little pouting and, maybe resent or whatever. And finally I had enough and I just called him. I said, look, in a sense, here's the boundary. If you want to be my friend, you have to trust that I am your friend and not act like this. And if you're able to do it, great. If not, this isn't going to work. Well, what do you know? He started rising up, in the friendship, acting like properly. And now we have a great friendship 20, 30 years later. So that's how the Lord, through honesty, communication leads to expectation. I think great friendships can be forged. And what happens? Both of you become real men. He becomes a man. He overcomes that. I become a man because I become brave enough and not saying, okay, I don't know if I want to talk to him about this, blah, blah. No, I inject and then boom, the friendship starts to grow because we're trusting each other.
Excellent. Sam.
Yeah, this idea of boundaries is so important for healthy relationships. Why? Because it's something you said, Devin, that I think is really important. Well, maybe it was your daughter who said it, but like the no without guilt. Why is it important to be able to say no without guilt? Because freedom lies in the will, and what does the will do almost exclusively is say yes and no. And if you can't say no, you're not really free. What do we call that?
Yes, right.
Like, let's say if I can't say no to sweets. Um, that's called an
You're
addiction,
slave.
right? Like, and if I can't say
That's right.
no to pornography, like that's called an addiction, right? And so it's amazing to me though, when it's something good, we never think about that. Like someone, we need volunteers for the church picnic. Okay, I could say yes or I could say no. That's freedom, right? But if it's like, oh, I have to do that. I have to go and volunteer for the church picnic. That's actually not a free choice. Like if there's something
Yeah.
in you that won't allow you to say no, you're not really a free person. Even if what you're doing is something objectively good. And so I think it's very important that we're in the season of Lent, right? And we talk about fasting and asceticism and giving things up. And all of that's doing is training our will to be able to say yes and to be able to say no. If hey, Starbucks is right there. I'd love to stop and get a coffee, right? But if I can't say no to myself, I don't have the money. Well, that's not wise. That's a lot of sugar. Or it's Starbucks, a corrupt, degenerate company.
Yeah, say no to Starbucks. Yeah, Satan
Yeah,
bucks.
right.
Say no to Satan bucks.
But if I can't say no to myself in that moment, something wrong, right? I'm an addict at that point.
Yeah.
And
Or
likewise,
slave.
yeah. And we don't want to be slaves. We want to be genuinely free. And only genuinely free people can say no without guilt. And that's what we're working towards here when we talk about boundaries. And when you first erect a boundary in your life, it's going to be uncomfortable. People don't want to do this.
Yes.
This is why they swing to those extremes of being a doormat.
Yeah.
And then after they've been walked on for long enough and they get fed up, then they swing to this like extreme of aggression where maybe they lash out finally. And people are like, where did that come from? He's normally so nice. He's normally so calm. Well, it's because some part of you is fed up being a doormat, right? But the healthy balance, that golden mean, right, is being able to say no freely and being able to say yes freely. All sacrifice should come from a true place of freedom, not from I have to. I could say no to this sacrifice, right? But I'm freely choosing it out of love. That's radically different than this compulsive need to people please and like keep throwing yourself under the bus in order to keep everybody else happy. That's not actually a free sacrifice. And we all know people who, maybe do that. I've known different people in my life who will literally run themselves into the ground. And it's like, why are you doing this to yourself? And it's like this compulsive need to be that martyr, to be that person that's always there, that's always meeting everyone else's needs without ever taking care of themselves. And it's not freedom, it's slavery.
And I think that's awesome, Sam, because a lot of times as good Catholics, we can have that Irish Catholic guilt where we're like, oh no, Jesus is demanding me to be that doormat. And Jesus is demanding me to just suck it up. And no, he's not. No, he is not. And I fear for I have sorrow for women who are in marriages and relationships like this, where they think that they have to have sex with their husband or their boyfriend to keep him or whatever, because I can't say no. I'm not allowed to. I just have, this is just part of what I have to do to either maintain the relationship or to just be a good Christian wife. Blah. No, that's disgusting. That's wrong. And that's when that woman, like you're saying, Sam, she becomes a slave. And so I love that. I'm all with you on that.
Yeah. And for freedom, Christ has set us free. Like we must embrace the freedom of the children of God. And I also want to emphasize, like, Christ's sacrifice for us was completely free. It was the freest act in all of history. Like, no one made him do that. And he could have said no. No obligation there. Like, no one, like, there's no have to there. Christ did it out of love for us, like radical love for us.
Yes.
But he didn't have to. He could have just let us all, drop into hell and washed his hands of it, right? Like he had no obligation there.
Hoped that it would.
Exactly. So it's just this idea of freedom is so key, and boundaries are an expression of freedom. This far, no further. I want to be in relationship with you. I want to. This is not about cutting you off. I'm trying to make this relationship work, but you can't use me. You can't manipulate me. You can't, gaslight me or do all of these unhealthy behaviors that people can fall into, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. But boundaries are saying, I am a free human being. I am not going to let you treat me this way. Because the unfortunate fact is fallen human nature is such that people will take as much as you allow them to take.
Yes.
If you allow someone to call you 5 times a day, you never say anything and you never ignore their calls or anything, you're just always available for them, they're going to keep doing it until you say no more. So this is an exercise of growing in freedom and learning to exercise that will where true love actually flows from.
Yeah, I completely agree. And something you said, and we need to move on to the next one, but it's something that you said about being able to say no and fasting and prayer and these sort of self-disciplines that we do are helping us be able to be the man that can say yes or no. And what you're saying is that this is discipline, right? We're called to be disciples, right? Disciples and discipline have the same root words there as to teach, right? And so we're teaching ourselves through our practices, through here we are in Lent, through fasting and everything. That's one of the great merits and one of the great benefits of fasting is being able to say no to ourselves so that we can therefore be able to understand where to say no in other places in life. And I'll just say that I appreciate the clarity because boundaries might need to come up by the sheer fact that you are only one person. You do not have infinite amount of time on your hand. And so those boundaries might need to come up with new individuals that are coming into your life that would be a good friend, but at this season in life, other obligations are required of you. So let's move on to the next one, which is barriers. And these barriers are very strict, right? Is that when you have relationships, either brothers or what do we say at the beginning, neighbors, right? Kind of brotherhood and then neighbors in the secular world, there might be, for those neighbors, might be barriers that you have to set up. And those barriers are very much established boundaries. That you're not going to be engaging in any long-term communications with this individual because of various reasons that I hope we'll be able to go into later in this episode. But I think immediately of my life as a father and how this idea of boundaries has taken on a new shape as a father. And I think about it for the protection of my children. Both from other adults. So for instance, there are other families that we will not hang around because the parents in that family are not being parents, frankly, and expose their children to all sorts of debauchery and to things that are beyond a child shouldn't ever see or be exposed to. And I'm talking about, R-rated movies and a lot of cussing and, access to technology nonstop, these sort of things. We have to put that barrier in place. And my kids know, that we're not going over to their house, even if they invite us. Also, I establish boundaries with with children and playing with other kids who are being conditioned by the world and conforming their minds to the world in the opposition to, as it says, Romans 12, or we have to not conform our minds to the patterns of this world or the ways of this world, but conform them to Christ. And so when I see, especially since my children are so impressionable, it's really important for me to protect them from those outside sources. Whenever I'm aware of them and capable of them. So, Devin, love to hear your thoughts about this final barrier, final level.
Exactly. We have to protect so that we can inject. We protect our children so that we can inject them into society to convert and transform society into a noble, moral, virtuous society. But you don't put your pearls before swine. You don't throw your kids out there in the transgender ideological culture and say, oh, go get them, tiger. No, your kids are going to be like swept away with it because they don't want to be left out. They don't want to be marginalized or feel weird. And the world is excellent at oppressing us and making us feel like we're the oddball out. So this is where we're going to have to be strong. And this is where a man becomes a man as a father, as he says, nope, this is a barrier. You are not, we are not doing X. We are not doing Y. We're not spending time with those people. And those are hard decisions. We had a situation, and I'm just going to be we had a situation where we started hanging out with another couple through Christian circles. And it was a new relationship. And, my daughter was like, we were all hanging out in the living room. We were talking and my daughter was gone. And so was their daughter. And I was like, but my radar was up, thanks be to God. And this girl was trying to do something abusive to my daughter. And fortunately, we caught it just in time. My daughter has no recollection of this at all. They were very young. But I had to, and this is where I had to approach this guy and say, hey, what's going on here? I was charitable about it, but look, what's going on here? And then barriers had to be established. And I was like, okay, I will meet with him personally and we will walk through this together. And sure enough, there was a lot underneath the hood and we had to, move through a lot of that together. But there was a point where it finally, he had to make some decisions on his own. And those decisions involved a divorce and et cetera, which was very problematic. He wasn't willing to face the problems he had. But that's where I have a job. The serpent is not going to enter my garden if I can help it, right?
Amen.
And so I have got to put my foot down and I've got to lay down my body like a good shepherd would, at the door of the sheepfold, at the gate. And I'm not perfect at that. I'm not trying to give the wrong impression here, but I'm just saying that there are times where these barriers, we have to move through that. Okay, this is a pause in a relationship to, okay, wait, I need some boundaries here too. We need to create some barriers to keep this separated at some level, and Jesus did this a lot, just in the gospel recently, he's done all these signs. He's fed the crowds with tons of bread, 4,000 people plus women and children. He's done all these miraculous signs of healing the blind and all this. And then the Pharisees say, hey, can you give us a big sign? Give us something that we really can believe in. And Jesus, he sighs from the depth of his soul, which is a sigh of grieving in the Greek. He's just so fed up and frustrated with these people. So what does he do? He gets in a boat and he moves across the sea and he gets away from them. And then he creates another barrier. He says to his disciples, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. Watch out for the leaven of Herod, because what they're doubters who are going to try to undermine your belief. And so he establishes another barrier. So we can learn from Christ in this. It's not that we're called to be separatists, but there's a time where we have to draw the line in the sand and say, and usually like in Christ's case, he's protecting his disciples. Usually in our case, it's where we're protecting our wives and our children. Because generally we can stay in a relationship somewhat and still, meet with this person so often and still retain our faith, still retain strong, unless we've got addictions and problems. But anyway.
Yeah. No, I think it's really good. Sam, please.
I think the barriers too it absolutely is for our families and protecting our families, but also for yourself. I think there's times when people are actively harming you and you just have to say, I can't put myself in contact with this person anymore. And tragically, sometimes that can even be parents. Parents can be really abusive sometimes. And maybe you've gotten older and you're like, even after your conversion, like you're like still trying to maintain a relationship with them because God says honor your father and mother and like we should love our parents and I do love my parents and like maybe I should just keep trying. You're like, no, actually you don't have to do that. You can forgive someone without allowing yourself to continually be actively harmed by them. And if we're talking about something that's ongoing, they're still trying to manipulate you, they're still verbally abusing you, they're still harming you in some way, it's okay to draw a line, even with your parents, and say, I can't do this anymore. I need, for the health of my soul, for the health of my emotional life, like, I need to step back and not engage with you anymore. And anyone like that. And I think this is a really good point, like a really good time to identify what we even talk about when we say toxic people, what are we talking about? Maybe we should have clarified this at the beginning, but for me, it's like anyone who's actively doing harm. And and I will also clarify that it's someone who's actively doing harm and unwilling to listen and unwilling to change. If someone is willing to hear you out and there's a willingness for growth there, they're not a toxic person. They're just a difficult person. And that's what's different, is that difficult people can be doing harmful things, but once you bring it to their attention, they're truly contrite and they're willing to say, like, how can I learn and grow? How can we make this better? But a toxic person won't do that. A toxic person is harming you and they're unwilling to stop harming you. Okay? Like, that's the red flag to look for, is if they are unwilling to change, even after your attempts at communication, after your attempts at breaks and boundaries and all of that, if they are still leaning in and persisting in this harmful behavior, they are a toxic person and they need a hard no in your life. Like, whether that's, blocking their phone number, not letting you talk to them, texting anymore, like anything like that. Like, if you need to do it, you need to do it, because Christ never calls us to allow ourselves to be actively abused by other people. That's not what sacrificial love is about. Okay. And sometimes people are unaware of their behavior, but once you bring it to their attention, they are responsible at that point for what they do with that. And some people actually are malicious enough that they are trying to hurt you. They're aware of it and they know it, and they're trying to hurt you. Those kind of people, there's no, well, let's work this out. Like, let's negotiate. Let's, discern how we can still be friends. Or no, like, at that point, if that's the impression that you're getting, is that they know what they're doing and they just don't care, or worse, they're blaming you and gaslighting you, which is saying it's actually your problem. I don't have a problem. It's you. You're just too sensitive, or you're just too, your feelings get hurt too much, or whatever. Like that's a big red flag, and that's where those hard breaks need to come. Or not breaks. What's the B that we're on?
Barriers. Yeah, barriers.
That's where a barrier is necessary, absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And you should not feel bad about that. It is absolutely a sign of respecting your own dignity as a child of God to say, no, I'm going to cut you out of my life if you continue to treat me this way. And, that should not be undertaken lightly. It should be after attempts at making things work, as scripture indicates. Like, we should go to people and try to work things out. But if we can't, and they're still harming you, then you have every right to say no more.
Hasta la vista, baby.
That's right.
That's right. So yeah, thank you, Sam. I really appreciate that. I think that's excellent and a great place for us to move on to the next thing. So we're going to go in far more into this inside of Catholic Gentleman Plus, as well as talk about what holy detachment looks like and how to achieve it inside of Catholic Gentleman Plus. So if you like this conversation and you want more of it, head over to Catholic Gentleman Plus. It's a great way of supporting us. And again, we go into a deeper conversation every week. But one thing I do want to give here in this public edition of the episode is that I do want to quickly talk about how do we identify those relationships that are in need of these breaks, boundaries, or barriers that we've just talked about. And we have just kind of a little set system of 4 Ps to kind of help identify that. Because again, we're men, and in the minds of men, it does really help for us to guide this, because we've had this long conversation, but now you might be thinking about every single person in your life and not quite really realizing, where they fit within this. And so hopefully these next things will guide you and identifying that. So Devin, if you want to just quickly go through those 4 before we get on to putting on the new man and end this public edition, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 4 Ps, if you will, where we can apply either breaks, boundaries, or barriers, is the first one is pleasures. So it's a relationship that's drawing out, pleasure. So it's drinking night, game night, whatever. You're partying with your friends at the dance club, whatever it is. So this relationship, what kind of pleasure is it driving towards? Is it making me a better person or not a better person? Do I have to establish a break here, or do I have to establish, a boundary or a barrier? Then you've got the second one, which is pursuits or projects. So you've got let's say you got the father-in-law who's always having you over to work on something at his house. You got the sponger who's always wanting you to do something for them, right? Needing more money. Okay, well, I mean, just the pursuits and projects. Look, I need you to do something for me all the time. That's another category. Then you got personalities, and we've talked about this pretty much the whole time, but you've got the personality that is disagreeable, or they're cursing, or they're vile, or they're volatile, or they're emotional, or they're negative, or they're, whatever they are, they're critical and condemning, or they're an enabler, or whatever it is. That's one of the categories we gotta go, you know what? Our personalities really are not meshing no matter how hard I try. So do I either need to put a break here, a boundary, or a barrier? And then the last P, besides those other three, is perversion. And that's what Sam was talking about, where someone is abusing you sexually, emotionally, physically, mentally. You're being used, you're being abused. There's toxicity and there's gossip and, this criticalness all the time. So there's a perversion of the good in the relationship. And so in that case, for sure, in my opinion, barriers have to be applied, and you may be able to maintain a relationship, and then I would just say there's another P, and the P is problem, and the problem is actually a lot of times us, so that's identifying the problem, which is me or you, and making sure that we're not just writing off people. But I think that by taking these categories of these 4 Ps, right, which is pleasures, pursuits or projects, and then you got personalities, and you got perversion or perverted people, you can really go through that process of, is this where a break is needed? Is this where a boundary is needed? Is this where a barrier is needed? And it just really helps to give a good framework.
It does. And I really love that, because it's oftentimes that we meet these individuals in our lives, family or friends, and we know that there's just something off, and we're just frustrated, right? And then our frustration, kind of our spine, perks up, and we don't really know why. I think these can really help us better understand why and the differences that we are currently in life, so that we can better establish these different breaks and roadmap, if you will, towards healthy relationships. So I want to shift here, and I want to put on the new man, right? So this is the challenge that we give every week. My challenge for men this week is we are here during Lent, and I don't want you to just abstain from meat on Fridays. I actually want you to fast on Fridays. Let this be your opportunity to grow in fasting, not just during Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, but actually throughout the entire year. Fasting that's just episodic is something that's never receiving the fullness of fruits and abilities that fasting can bring to us. So Catholic Gentlemen Plus members are fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, as well as abstaining from meat on Wednesdays and Fridays during Lent. But I would encourage you, if you're listening, to start fasting every Friday. Again, know where you're at, though, when it comes to fasting. It's really important that you're not trying to give up breakfast and lunch and only have dinner if you've never fasted regularly before. And maybe for you, just not snacking between meals is the start of your fast, in which case that can be a very meritorious and beautiful fast. So I really strongly want to encourage you, don't come up with excuses as to why you can't. Find a way that you can, and commit to it, so that you can become a new man in Easter, one that's willing to carry that banner forward, the banner of Christ throughout Easter. So
great.
Awesome. And as we end each of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.